Hi, it's Dr. Scott Watson with a video on chord progressions in tonal music. From around 1700 up until 1850, let's say Bach to Brahms, there was a conventional type of chord progressions that were used by tonal composers in Western music at least, and that's what we're going to start or sort of center on. At the center of all of this is the circle of fifths, which is the pattern of ascending fourth bass lines and chords built on those ascending fourth bass lines that explain things like key signatures and scales, and hopefully you're aware of what the circle of fifths is. And the circle of fifths is the basis of much of Western music, and especially the movement from the chord built on the fifth scale degree called the dominant to the chord built on the first scale degree called the tonic. That movement of an ascending fourth from 5 to 1 in tonal music is called a circle progression because it's based on the circle of fifths. And a circle progression can be as simple as the dominant to the tonic, sometimes called an authentic cadence in music theory. But it can actually be several of those ascending fourths. So for instance, just instead of just 5 to 1, you could have 2 to 5 to 1. That would be the supertonic to the dominant to the tonic. And it can be even much longer. In fact, when you have a pattern where you go ascending fourth, and then another ascending fourth, and then another ascending fourth, and so on, when you follow a pattern, we call that a harmonic sequence. Sequence simply means pattern. By the way, you can also have melodic sequences in that you can take a melodic gesture and then map that onto another pitch level and repeat that same melodic contour or gesture, and you'll have a melodic sequence. So often, harmonic and melodic sequences accompany one another. Look at this example where we have a melodic sequence in the right hand or the top of the keyboard part, and then we have, if you follow the bass line, you'll notice that it's doing the ascending fourth, which can also be a descending fifth, right? That's the same thing. If you go from G up to C, that's an ascending fourth. But if you go from G down to C, that's a descending fifth. So they're basically the same. So this example I'm going to play for you is an example of the circle progression, right? A circle of fifths progression. You follow the bass line, it's ascending fourths, but it also has a melodic sequence up on top. So we're combining that. And this is the chord progression I want to talk about in this video. So just listen. Of course, the circle progression has appeared in music for centuries, from Pachelbel's canon back in the Baroque, all the way up to the current time. The jazz standard Autumn Leaves uses that circle progression. Or this number by singer-songwriter Lionel Richie, Hello, released in the 1980s.
I can see it in your eyes, I can see it in your smile. You're all I've ever wanted. My arms are open wide.
Okay, we've seen the circle progression in action, and we've seen that it can be as simple as just the dominant to the tonic, 5-1. Let's take it back to the supertonic, then the dominant, the tonic, so 2-5-1, and we'll just look at a 3-chord circle progression. Here it is in a short excerpt from a minuet by Beethoven. So what does all of this mean? Well, we're trying to show you that if you want to write conventional tonal music, these are chord progressions that work. 2-5-1 is perhaps the most used chord progression in all of tonal music. By the way, that arrow at the end of the diagram I showed after the tonic shows that the tonic can go to any chord. But dominant goes to tonic. It has that sort of impulse. And then supertonic wants to go to dominant, which wants to go to tonic. Again, this is a generalization, but just bear with me for a minute. Okay, so let's go back another fourth. We'll go down another fourth to the 6th chord, the chord built on the 6th scale degree, sometimes called the submediant. So now instead of just 2-5-1, it'll be 6-2-5-1. And for this, we're going to share an example by the opera composer Giuseppe Verdi. Okay, let's keep going with our circle progression. We'll descend another fourth down to the mediant, the chord built on the third scale degree. This chord doesn't get used as much as you might think. Normally, if a bass line uses the third scale degree, many composers would choose to use the tonic in first inversion, where the third of the tonic chord is actually the third scale degree. However, you can find some examples where the mediant chord or the chord built on the third scale degree is used. We're going to share an example by Bach. All right, we're already pretty far away from the tonic at the mediant, but if we go back yet another fourth, we get to the leading tone chord. It turns out that the leading tone chord can precede the mediant chord in certain instances, harmonic sequences especially. However, we're going to show in our chart the leading tone chord where it is almost always used, and that is in two instances. One, it is the substitute for a dominant. If you take the notes of a dominant 7 chord, you eliminate the root of the dominant 7 chord, you're left with a leading tone chord. So because it shares so many of the same notes as the dominant 7, it's used as a substitute for the dominant. So that's where we're going to put it in the chord chart. Also, remember that at the end of the chord chart, there's that little arrow. The tonic chord can go to any chord earlier. Sometimes the tonic chord goes to the leading tone and then to the tonic 6. Same thing in reverse. You could have a tonic 6, which is a tonic in first inversion, and it can go to the leading tone and then back to the tonic. So in that instance, we basically say that the leading tone chord is prolonging the tonic, right? Tonic and then tonic 6, or tonic 6 and then tonic. And in between is just a little detour that prolongs the tonic. And in that instance, we'll also find the leading tone in first inversion, the leading tone 6. Here's an example where you'll see the leading tone 6 in between a tonic and a tonic 6 in just that sort of prolongation of the tonic. Next, we're going to add the subdominant chord to our chord chart. We're going to do the same thing we did with the leading tone chord. The way the leading tone is a substitute for the dominant, the subdominant is a substitute for the supertonic. You can see that the supertonic shares two of its notes with the subdominant, so they can be used interchangeably, and that's why we're going to put it where we're going to put it in the chord chart. First, let me just share that the subdominant can go directly to the tonic, and we have a special arrow indicating that. When the subdominant goes to the tonic, we call it a plagal cadence, 4-1. Here's an example from a Haydn piano concerto where we can hear that sort of 4-1 progression. Notice in the last measure of this example, there's a tonic 6-4 that proceeds to the dominant. In this case, the tonic 6-4 is a predominant. It sets up the dominant. In fact, the bass note of the tonic 6-4 is the same as the bass note of the dominant in root position. So there's such a thing as a predominant, a chord that comes before the dominant. The supertonic, 2, that's a predominant as well, 2-5-1. And tonic 6-4, 5-1. Shows us a predominant. So another use for the subdominant chord, that's why I'm telling you all this, is that the subdominant chord is very often used as a predominant, the chord that precedes the dominant. Here's an example where we see the 4 chord proceed to the 5 chord. It's used as a predominant, and that's why we have it where it is in our chord chart. Well, just as the leading tone was a substitute for the dominant, and just as the subdominant chord was a substitute for the supertonic, we have another exception, and that is that the 6th chord, the chord built on the 6th scale degree called the submediant, that is often used as a substitute for the tonic. In fact, the dominant usually goes to the tonic, but when the dominant goes to the submediant instead as a substitute, we call that a deceptive cadence, because the expectation of the listener when they hear the dominant is that the tonic will follow. Well, when the dominant is followed by the submediant, they're deceived, right? So it's called a deceptive cadence, and we hear this all over the place in classical and popular music. Another exception is the 3 chord. The median sometimes can go to the 4 chord. So we've adjusted our chord chart for those exceptions. The 3 to the 4 happens very rarely, but I do want to give you an example of the dominant proceeding to the submediant, or the deceptive cadence. And here we have an example in a piano piece by Haydn. The deceptive cadence is used so much, I just want to give you one more example of the dominant chord, instead of proceeding to the tonic, going to the submediant. Here's a Mozart French horn piece where we actually hear it several times. Let me close our discussion of chord progressions, and specifically the circle progression, and then all of those substitutes for chords in the circle progression. Let's wrap this up by just talking about some of the idiosyncrasies of the minor mode, because we've been giving you major mode examples in the most part, and the minor mode will hold up. The chord progressions are almost the same. Some exceptions though. One is that the chord preceding the mediant, since the mediant will be a major chord in the minor mode, right? The 3 chord is actually major. The chord that's a fourth lower than that would be the 7 chord, the subtonic, not the leading tone, but the subtonic, the lowered 7th. That major chord on the lowered 7th scale degree does actually progress to the 3 chord, to the median chord, fairly frequently in the minor mode. The other thing I wanted to mention is that in the minor mode, in the natural minor mode, the dominant is actually a minor chord, although in tonal music, we very frequently hear that dominant as a major chord. But sometimes the tonic does progress to a minor dominant on its way to a minor subdominant, and then that progresses to a major dominant. And that is called a Phrygian cadence. Now, why it's called a Phrygian cadence has to do with modal music. It's outside of the scope of this discussion, but it's a Phrygian cadence. Okay, just a word about the idea of having a dominant go to a subdominant like it does in the Phrygian cadence. You'll notice that they're an inversion, and in tonal era music, usually when the dominant chord proceeds to the subdominant, it's in inversion. When a dominant in root position goes to a subdominant in root position, a lot of music theorists call that a retrogression, and they think it's a very unattractive chord progression because composers of the tonal era didn't use that, the 5 to the 4. Now, popular music these days especially use it all the time, so it's not like we're saying the chord progression isn't used, but in concert art music, Bach through Brahms, you wouldn't find that 5 to 4. So if you're trying to write music that's characteristic of that, avoid that progression in root position. But anyway, it does occur in an inversion, so you can have a dominant 6 go to a subdominant 6. Okay, so let's take a look at our 2 chord charts in major and minor, and you can see they're almost the same except for some of those exceptions that I've outlined. Hopefully a holistic way to look at this is basically we have ascending fourths, we have that circle progression, and then we have a category of chords that are substitutes for chords in the circle progression, like the leading tone for the dominant, or the subdominant for the supertonic, or the submediant for the tonic. And then we have a few just very idiosyncratic exceptions. So hopefully this all makes sense and wrapped up in one package. One final parting thought, and that is that what we're presenting here is a way to have your music sound like conventional tonal era music. In fact, these aren't rules, they're just conventions of the tonal era. It was Debussy who actually said composers don't follow rules, they make them. And certainly Bach didn't follow a set of rules. These were invented by music theorists hundreds of years later. So good luck writing chord progressions that are characteristic of the tonal period by using these conventions.